집사님, 안녕하세요.
안녕하세요.
반갑습니다.
네.
We're about to start the lecture. I'm going to split you up into probably two groups afterwards. And there'll be a very brief time of discussion at the end. But right now, we're going to go into just an overview of the Old Testament. So, yes, I will get started now. So I'm going to mute you all. I am not going to allow you to unmute yourselves until after I am finished. So you guys are now silent. Okay. With that, let me go ahead and share and we'll get started. Okay. I'm actually going to make a separate cacao room for this. Why am I not doing slideshow? And I'll be sharing the PDFs of these documents so you guys can have access to it, and you'll need it later anyway. So yes, we're looking at an overview of basically the history of Israel in a very broad snap and the Jewish identity. So what I want you to understand is that the reason why we're doing this is so that we can have an understanding of what the people who were receiving this prophecy from Haggai were thinking, like what concepts were in their minds, what kind of identities they were carrying with them. And so when you talk about Israelites, who's the starting point? Now, I could go all the way back to Adam, but if you start with Adam, basically you're talking about all of humankind, kind of similarly going back to Noah. So really, we start with Abraham, Father Abraham. And so, as you guys know, Abraham was called by God at the age of 75, so he was not a young man, but he was called to go. He was called to leave the land where he was at, to leave the household of his family, to leave everything behind and just basically go where God was sending him. Now he's important because the first time the Old Testament uses the Hebrew word for believe is in Genesis 15, which is part of the covenant, which I'll get into later. So he is considered the first believer in God. And so he believed that God's promise was going to come true. Now, originally his wife could not bear children. And so he compromised, thinking, well, maybe God wants to use my servant Eliezer. God told him no. And then he ends up miraculously having a child through the wife's servant, Hagar, Ishmael, at the age of 86, which in and of itself is a miracle. But that was not the intention of God. Later in Genesis 17, where he is really finally renewing the covenant with God for the third time, that's when the practice of circumcision comes. And circumcision, I'm not going to get into detail about what circumcision is, but that is basically the sign of being part of the people of God. So that is something he receives. And so, even after that, miraculously, Isaac is born at the age of 100. So Sarah was 90. Abraham was 100. Actually, back in Genesis 17, just a year before, was when he was given the name change from Abram to Abraham. So not just father, but the father of all fathers. and so, but the thing with Abraham, interestingly, is he actually has more children after Sarah. After Isaac. So you look later after Sarah passes away, he takes another wife named Keturah, and he has 6 more sons. So yeah, Abraham was a very, very blessed man, and he died at the ripe age of 175. Now the covenant, the promise that God made to him, happened 3 times in Genesis 12, Genesis 15, and Genesis 17. It starts off very broad, very general, but it becomes more and more specific. So the very broad understanding is that God is going to bless him and to make him into a great nation. And basically, to be a nation, you require 2 things. You need people, and you also need land. So basically, Abraham understood that, okay, God is going to give me a son. You jump to Genesis 15, that son hasn't come. And so he's thinking, okay, this is going to be, I'll use my servant Eliezer, who's like a son to me. That's good enough. God says, no, I'm going to provide a son from your own body. That's where Ishmael comes into play, but that again was not God's intention. So he makes that clear in chapter 17. And so in chapter 15, the land becomes specific, which is what we understand today to be the land of Israel and Palestine. And then the name change happens in 17, and then circumcision comes. So you have these promises that happen 3 times, and it gets more and more specific each time. And then it ends with Abraham having his name changed, which as you know, in the Old Testament is really a transformation of identity, a transformation of your fate. And so God instills that upon him. And so he carries this promise with him. Now, just a broad overview, whenever the Bible uses the term fathers, usually in the Old Testament, is referring to the first 3 generations, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, Rebecca is important because she obviously marries Isaac, but like Abraham, she's called to go. Like Abraham, she's called to leave her family behind and basically take a step of faith. And the interesting thing about about Rebecca, is that Rebecca was actually, she was going to be Isaac's wife. Abraham sends his servant to find her. The servant shows like a very amazing relationship with God. He's praying, he's worshiping God. And what the servant proclaims is that Rebecca is the hesed, the loving kindness, the everlasting love of God, not to Isaac, but to Abraham. Now, the interesting thing is Isaac, as you know, was almost sacrificed by his own father, right? His father was about to kill him with a knife. A lot of people call that the binding of Isaac. And a lot of people believe that really messed up with him psychologically. And so what we understand is when this servant is looking for his wife, Isaac is not in a good place, right? Sarah, passes away during that time. So he's, honestly, I really question just the sanity of Isaac at that point in his life. But ultimately, God provides this wife, Rebecca, and in that the proclamation isn't that this is the hesed of Isaac, but it's the hesed of Abraham. So in many ways, I think this kind of restores him. Unfortunately, I didn't talk about this, but Abraham was not a very good husband, as you know. And so not once, but twice, he basically left his wife to others, both in Egypt and to Abimelech. And so unfortunately, Isaac follows in the footsteps of his father and does the same thing with Rebecca. But even so, God intervenes, and then God reveals himself. And so one of the things that you'll see in the book of Genesis, and not just Genesis, but in the Old Testament as a whole, is that there is a lot of repetition that goes on from generation to generation. Issues that you see in one generation often repeat in others. Blessings that happen in one generation carry on into the next. And so here we see Isaac repeating the mistake of his father Abraham. Now fast forward, Isaac has 2 sons, Jacob and Esau. Now they're twins. They're fighting over over who is first and whatnot. And ultimately Isaac favors Esau. He favors the manly son. And ultimately Jacob, who is more of a mama's boy, learns about deception through his mom. And so through Rebecca, he kind of learns how to trick his son, Esau, his technically older brother, into selling him his birthright and to get the blessing from Isaac the father. But then that passes on. Ultimately, Jacob goes, he goes off, he runs away because he knows Esau wants to kill him. And ultimately, the trickster gets tricked. He goes to Laban, his uncle, and falls in love with Rachel. Goes crazy head over heels and gets tricked into not 7 years, but 14 years of labor. Now, as I've recounted the story before, I truly believe that, Rachel was the girl that he wanted, but not necessarily the girl that he needed. When you look at the relationship that Rachel and Leah have with God, is that, the key indicator is what name of God they use when they pray. Leah always uses Yahweh, the personal name of God, whereas Rachel always uses Elohim, the very generic term for God. And so that shows a different intimacy. But not only that, in how they named their sons, is that Leah named her sons with just, they're praising and honoring God. Whereas Rachel, the names of her sons are very vindictive. Joseph basically means to add another. She wasn't happy with just one son. And ultimately, the children that Leah, gives to Jacob are actually the ones that end up becoming the most important sons among the 12 that become the tribes of Israel. But ultimately, regardless, Jacob, he wrestles with God. He gets that name Israel. Again, name changes are very important in the Bible. But this name change, Israel basically means struggles with God. Not a very good name, but that ultimately becomes the name of the nation. And that name also, whenever it's used instead of Jacob in the Bible, is usually more of an indication of God reminding him that is his covenant name, that God had given him that name, and God had transformed him into what will become the backbone of the nation. And so with that, you see through 3 generations that what God had promised Abraham is already starting to come to completion. God had promised that I will bless you and make you into a great nation. And by the time we get to Jacob, we're seeing that starting, where he has 12 sons. And those 12 sons are going to carry this nation. Now we jump to Joseph. Joseph is the 4th generation. And what we see when we go through these generations is that as the favor of God passes to generation, you're starting to see that the faith of the generations kind of matures. And so even though Joseph starts off as kind of a very arrogant, kind of cocky son, not really the nicest brother to have, there's a reason why his brothers were angry at him. He was constantly bragging about how loved he was. He's even, telling his dreams about this. And so ultimately his brothers sell him into slavery. And he's in slavery for 13 years. So he ends up living a very hard life. But ultimately, God gives him the ability, amazing abilities, the ability to interpret dreams. And he's a very resourceful man. Wherever he goes, people are being blessed. But the key thing about Joseph, unlike before, you start to see that he is always saying this is because of God. He's always recognizing where this is coming from. And ultimately, God elevates him to become the second most powerful person just below Pharaoh in Egypt. And through this, he's not only able to save Egypt, the nation, which is going to go into famine for 7 years, but he's able to save many nations around him. And not only that, he saves his family. And so through Joseph, the son, the beloved son that was sold into slavery, we see a wonderful redemption. Now, the interesting thing when you look at the book of Genesis is that you would assume that the story is mostly about Joseph, but it's actually more about the redemption of Jacob, his father. And so Jacob, in many ways, particularly in the latter years of his life, kind of messes up a lot. But we see that through his son, Joseph, who he loved so much and in many ways was taken away from him, that God redeems him. And ultimately, that's how the book of Genesis ends. Now, they're saved from death by famine, but then they end up staying in Egypt for 430 years. So now we fast forward, or before we fast forward, I want to go back and explain 2 key people, Judah and Levi. They're important because we look at Judah as the line of kings and Levi as the line of priests. Now, going through the order of the sons, Reuben is the firstborn. And right off the bat in Genesis 35, we see that Reuben does something really bad. He sleeps with his father's concubine, and his father knows. Father calls him out on it. So he is automatically disqualified as the firstborn. Levi, number 2, Simeon, number 2, and Levi, number 3. They, in vengeance, they're angry because of what happened to their sister. They kill an entire city, right? These guys were crazy. And because of that, they're seen as bloodthirsty men, and they are disqualified as number 2 and number 3. So number 4 is Judah. Now, Judah in himself was not a good man. In Genesis 38, we see that he ends up sleeping with his daughter-in-law, who tricks him into this because he doesn't take care of her. He doesn't make sure that she's able to have a husband, because two of his sons die. And so ultimately she tricks him into this and ultimately gives birth to twins. And that's how the line continues to carry on. Now, because this wasn't a sin against his father, Jacob, it doesn't really affect his standing. So Judah was still the default head of the family at number 4 because of the disqualification of number 1, 2, and 3. So because of this, and you see the lack of Reuben's leadership in the book of Genesis. Whenever he tries to step up, he keeps making mistakes. So Judah shows up in Genesis, 44, and basically he takes charge of the family, and he brings them because he knows that if they don't do anything, they're going to die of starvation. But the thing that he does, which is remarkable and which is very important, is that he offers himself as a sacrifice. Now, at this point, Joseph is kind of messing with them, and Joseph is making things hard on them. And Judah steps in and says, you know what? I messed up before, but I'm not going to do it again. And so my younger brother hasn't done anything wrong, but whatever punishment, he's going to take, I'll take it upon myself. He's the first person in the Bible to actually offer himself in someone else's place. And so because of that, Joseph breaks down, and because of that, reconciliation happens. And through that, Judah actually becomes elevated and ultimately is given the crown of being the line of kings. And this is something imparted upon to him by his father Jacob. Jacob recognizes that Judah showed great leadership. And in that one moment, honestly, Judah was kind of a jerk before this. In that very brief period of time, Judah is completely redeemed, and because of that, his line becomes the most important of all the lines in all the tribes of Judah, of Israel, I should say. Now the Levites. Levi was a terrible guy, but basically what happened was Moses was a Levite, and then in Exodus 32, at the golden calf incident, Moses is like, "Who stands with me?" And his tribe, the Levites, stood with him. And they went and they killed a bunch of people in retribution for what had happened. But because of that, at that very moment, the Levites were set apart. They became a separate, rather than the firstborn of the Israelites being given to God as an offering, that entire tribe replaced them. And so that is why they became the line of priests. Because of that one moment, not in Levi's lifetime, but that one moment 400 years later, when they stood by Moses' side at Sinai. So I wanted to take a moment just so you understand why Judah and Levi became important. So Judah redeemed himself. Levi, it wasn't him. It had to do with the generations that followed later when they stood by Moses. Continuing on, jumping 400 years to Moses. As you know, Moses, they were supposed to kill all the boys. He got saved, and ultimately, down the river, and Pharaoh's daughter himself took him and adopted him, raised him as a prince. So for 40 years, he lived in the household of Pharaoh, and probably in many ways thought that he was going to be a great redeemer of Israel. He knew that he was a Jew. And then later on, you see that he tries to help some of the Jews out and ultimately ends up killing an Egyptian, becomes a fugitive because of this. So in many ways, I particularly believe Moses kind of had this complex where he thought he was going to be a savior. But that gets taken away from him. He ends up running away and he becomes an outcast. He becomes a shepherd. He's living out in the wilderness for 40 years. So 40 years as a prince, 40 years as a nomad. During that time, he gets married. He has children. And so he's basically 80 years old now and probably ready to just kind of move on in life. But that is when God meets him through the burning bush. And that is when he's given this calling to be the savior that he thought he was going to be way back when. And this happens through the power of God. Now, Moses keeps coming up with all these excuses. God keeps showing him that he can do this. He empowers him. He gives him the staff. And then he uses these amazing signs and wonders to ultimately free Israel from Egypt. to become his people and to worship him once more. So again, another covenant, another promise. Now, basically, when we talk about the Mosaic Covenant, we normally talk about the law of God, the law of Moses. And so at Mount Sinai, Moses goes up, and there's this pillar of fire, and Moses is face to face with God, receiving the law, which famously, was written on stone tablets. Now, what happens at Mount Sinai is the people of Israel, number one, they become a true nation, and number two, they're now viewed as God's possession, right? They're now viewed as his people. And so they are called to obey him. They are called to do what he wants them to do. And that is all written out in the law. Now, for those of you that wonder why the Reformed Church, Presbyterian Church, sprinkles instead of does full baptism, it's because of this scene at Mount Sinai. So at Mount Sinai, the people of Israel, becoming the people of God, are sprinkled with blood. And so that blood is the blood of this covenant, of this Mosaic covenant, and that is when they become the people of God. But one thing about the law that you need to understand is the law is, hundreds and hundreds of do's and don'ts, but not just that. It includes sacrifices, and sacrifices are important because the sacrifices represent a way to become reconciled with God. So if you sin, if you do something wrong, if you do something that you don't even know about, there are ways to restore your relationship with God, and that was sacrifices. Now the tabernacle was also included. Basically the tabernacle was this really big fancy tent, but what the tabernacle represented, even though God is present everywhere, it was a physical manifestation of that presence. That as you got deeper and deeper into the tabernacle, the presence of God became thicker and more tangible, and ultimately culminated with the Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies. And so the law is not just a list of do's and don'ts. It's also showing that God was giving a way for us to restore our relationship with him, and is also showing us that God desired to be among his people. He didn't want to be a distant God just telling us what to do from afar. He wanted to be present among us. So these are all key parts of the Mosaic Covenant, or the law of Moses. Now Moses, he might not technically be the first prophet listed in the Bible, but he's considered the ideal prophet, and all prophets were compared against him. And so he is the only prophet in the Old Testament who God spoke to face to face. And what you see from this point on is there would be generations that would follow. But the way God spoke to them became more and more diminished. It started to become dreams. It started to become visions. You go to Isaiah and it's like, in a whirlwind, he hears a faint whisper. And so the way God communicates starts to diminish as the generations pass. But the reason why they even needed a prophet to begin with goes back to Exodus 20, where the people of God hear the voice of God. The Israelites hear the voice of God at Mount Sinai, and they can't handle it. They're like, okay, we can't do this. Like, we feel like we're going to die. So you know what, Moses, why don't you speak to God for us? Why don't you be the mediator? Why don't you be the in-between man? And that is where this role comes from. But Moses is the only one who God spoke to face in the Old Testament. And as the generations followed after him, as is listed in Deuteronomy 18, this office of prophet, they were always compared against Moses, and he was always superior to them in many ways. Now, ultimately, this honor of being spoken to face is something that comes into play when Moses gets in an argument with his siblings, Miriam and Aaron. And ultimately God says, hey, back off. Moses is the only one who speaks to me face to face. Now later on, this office of prophet shows up again in the New Testament, where John the Baptist is going around and people are like, whoa, who are you? Like, we haven't seen a prophet like you in forever. And so they ask him in John 1:21, are you the prophet? And they're talking about the prophet listed in Deuteronomy 18. As you know, brothers and sisters, now the prophet that is foretold is, of course, Jesus Christ, but I'm not going to get into that right now. Regardless, Moses was the ideal prophet, the one that all prophets were compared against. Now, with Moses, after he freed them from Egypt, he freed the Israelites from Egypt. You now go into 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. Now, this 40 years happened because of rebellion. Had the Israelites not rebelled in Numbers 14, you know what? Maybe it wouldn't have been 40 years. Maybe that generation might have gone into the promised land. But because of that rebellion, because they rebelled and said, those spies that you sent in, only two of them gave a favorable report, Joshua and Caleb, and we don't trust them. We're scared. They're giants. We can't go in there. So because of that rebellion, they were to wander for 40 more years, and ultimately that generation was going to pass. Now, one other thing to know about the Israelites in the wilderness is that there are a lot of people. The census shows that there were 600,000 men. Now, that does not include women and children. So most people believe that when you include women and children, that there are probably around 2 million people, 2 million Israelites wandering the desert. So if you really think about that, that's basically a city. So a city of people is just wandering around in the desert for 40 years. But ultimately, God provides. God sends them food every day. He sends them manna, which literally means, what is it? And, after they get sick of that, God sends them quail so they have some meat. And, during this time, their clothes never wore out, which is an amazing thing. Think about it. For 40 years, your clothes never wore out. My clothes do not last that long, especially here in Korea with the pollution. I noticed my especially my collars get gross very quickly. So regardless, 40 years, clothes spotless. But even so, the 40 years in the wilderness, the Israelites complained again and again and again. And that's basically a common theme that we see during that time. Now we fast forward to Joshua, who would succeed Moses. And in the beginning of that book, as I've said before, he's just called Moses' aide. But ultimately, at the end of the book of Joshua, he is called the servant of the Lord, just as Moses was. Now, he is what we consider the first judge. He is not a king. He's a leader. But he's more of a military leader. His job was basically to conquer the promised land. So he goes through, and for roughly about 7 years, he leads conquest after conquest. Now, you have to understand, he was already 80 years or so by the time he started this. So after 7 years, he was kind of done with war. And so he ends up basically taking a break from war from that point on. Many times he renews the covenant that God had with his people. So one generation had passed, they had not gotten circumcised, so they got circumcised again in Joshua chapter 5. And he reads the law back to them in Joshua chapter 8. And so you see, one of the important things that has to happen that the book of Joshua shows is that this covenant, this relationship has to be renewed every single generation. Just the fact that these people were born into the people of God, they were born into, basically the favor of God with all the presents, the manna, all these great things, did not automatically make them part of the people of God. They had to renew the covenant. They had to be circumcised. They had to read and hear and understand the law. And in that same way, brothers and sisters, for us as believers, especially for those of us that have children, our children are not automatically going to be saved just because they're in a Christian household. At a certain point in their life, they have to make the choice. They have to make the decision to believe in and follow God. And so that's one of the most important things that I think shows up in the book of Joshua, is that generations have to continue to pick up that mantle of faith. It's not automatic. And so again, Joshua does this. He renews the law, but he does it again just before he passes away at the end of the book. Unfortunately, Joshua doesn't finish his job. So there's still, basically, they were supposed to wipe out all the people in the promised land. Now, basically, they were being told because of the sins of the people in that place, they needed to be judged. They were being judged for their sin. God was using the Israelites as his agent of judgment. So it wasn't just them conquering land just because they were great and they were just using their influence and abilities. God was actually exercising judgment across the entire land. But unfortunately, not everything was finished. Many people were left unconquered, and some people actually became included among the Israelites. The Gibeonites are an example. They tricked the Israelites into making a peace treaty with them. And so ultimately, they continued to live with the Israelites, from that point on. They were supposed to be wiped out just like everybody else. But in that moment, Joshua does not pray to God. Instead, he believes them and he accepts this peace treaty with them and ultimately allows them to survive. Not only that, the city of Jerusalem would not be conquered for 400 more years. So think about that. During this time, Jerusalem, which is right in the middle of all this, the Israelites are in this land, but this one city refused to be conquered for 400 years. And it wasn't until David finally became king of Israel, he's like, you know what? We need to finally conquer the city once and for all. And so Joshua, unfortunately, does not finish his job. So what that leads to is the era of judges. Now, the judges, again, were not kings. They were basically like Joshua. They were military leaders. God used them to fight against enemies, but they weren't actually meant to rule over the people like the king would. Now, because these Canaanites were not wiped out, they started to influence others. They started to influence the Israelites. So they were influencing them with their gods, their idols, the Baals and the Ashtaroths. Now, you have to understand the reason why this was important was, number one, God told the Israelites to wipe out everyone so this didn't happen. But the reason why this happened was Baal was considered the god of weather. Ashtaroth was considered the goddess of fertility. Now, for people that were farmers, these were the two most important things: weather and having a lot of children. The more children you have, the more work that can get done. So for these people, once they see that the weather is bad, once they see that they're not being able to bear children, and they come to the conclusion, our God is not powerful enough, our God is not doing his job, they turn to their neighbors. They're like, hey, what do you do when the rain doesn't come? What do you do when you're not bearing children? And so they're like, oh, I worship this God, I worship this God. And so in many ways, for us, we think about idolatry as just like a bunch of statues that people are bowing to. And yes, it was that. But the reason why they were doing that was because they felt God wasn't meeting their immediate needs. And so they're influenced by these other people. And so as they're influenced, God sends a nation that conquers them. And then as they're conquered, they start crying out, they're oppressed. God hears their cries and he raises up a leader, a judge, to deliver them from the things that are going on. Now, one of the key things that you see in the book of Judges, you start with Othniel, the first judge. We don't know that much about him, but what we do know is that he really cared about being in good favor with Caleb, one of the original spies. And so when Caleb says, if you conquer this land, you will get my daughter, as your wife, he's the one who does it. Not necessarily because he wants to marry his daughter, but more so because he wants to honor Caleb. And so what you see through Othniel is that this is probably a man that had a decent amount of faith. He understood what it meant to be among the Israelites worshiping Yahweh, the God of Israel. But with Othniel, he had a relatively large army, probably around 10,000 men. Now you continue on, you go to the very middle, you have Gideon. Gideon is not a man of character. He keeps going back and forth. He's very wishy-washy. And so, he asked God for a sign. God gives him that sign. He said, I don't know. So he's like, asked God for a harder sign. God finally gives it to him. But what happens with Gideon, he starts with thousands of soldiers, but God says, you know what? Cut that down to 300. He keeps cutting it down until there's only 300 men. And then when you get to the last judge, Samson, he is the absolutely most immoral judge. And honestly, one of the people I really question about whether they believed in God or not because of how he acted. Very, very hideous man, did hideous things. But God used him. But the thing with him was there's no army. Samson was one man. Through one man, God brought judgment against the Philistines. And so this, basically what you're seeing is two trends in the book of Judges. First, you have the morality of the people, of the leaders, and then it's steeply declining. But then you have the military strength, thousands of men to 300 to 1. What that is showing ultimately is that God is in control. God is the ruler of Israel. It's not these judges. It's not people like Othniel, who are great people that raise up great military strength. Yes, they did that once, but what God shows again and again is I can work through even someone as filthy as Samson. And so what you see in the book of Judges is that even though there's no king, God is ultimately the ruler of Israel. But ultimately, a king does come. Now, what you have to understand about the king is that it was always God's intention to give Israel a king. And this goes back to Deuteronomy 18. So this was part of the original law of Moses, was that God was going to send a king. But when you read Deuteronomy 18, verses 14 to 20, it describes someone who's more like a priest than a king, someone who studies the word of God, who writes out the word of God by his own hands and is meditating on it day and night, doesn't have that many wives, doesn't have much wealth. Now, this becomes important because Samuel is the last judge. He's growing old. His sons are not good people. And so the Israelites are worried. They're like, okay, when Samuel passes away, there's nobody left. So we need a king. But what they demand is not the king written about in Deuteronomy 18. They want a king just like everybody else. And so that type of king, as we see, shows itself in Saul. Saul is the exact model of the type of kings and rulers that were popular and successful during that time. He was really tall. He looked like a man's man. But when you look at his character, not necessarily the strongest character. In the very beginning, when Samuel finds him, he'd been looking for his donkeys for a couple of days, and he was basically giving up. So this was not a man of persistence, and in many ways was a coward. And so ultimately he becomes king, and he tries in the very beginning, but what he shows is a lack of patience and a lack of trust. Samuel says to wait for him, and then Samuel runs late. So he's like, where is this guy? And he starts to see his army starting to leave. And so Samuel had said, wait for me and I will give the sacrifice. I will lead worship. Instead, Saul decides to do that on his own because he gets nervous. He sees the soldiers leaving. So he does the sacrifice. He leads the worship. And then Samuel comes and he's like, what are you doing? You didn't listen to what I told you to do. And so Saul makes up this, and then basically it continues on. Saul is told to completely wipe out the Amalekites. He's supposed to kill the king. But back then, one of the things that kings did was whenever they conquered a nation, they would keep the king they conquered as basically a trophy. So they would parade them around and show them, like, hey, I defeated that guy, ha, ha, ha. And so that's basically what Saul intended to do. He defeated the Amalekites, but he kept the king alive. And he not only kept the king, but he kept the nice stuff, the nice horses, all the good things. And so when Samuel calls him out for it, Saul makes up this excuse. Oh, I was going to give that as a sacrifice to God. And that's where the famous line, to obey is better than sacrifice, comes. God desired Saul to listen to what he commanded him and to follow it to the letter. Instead, he did what he wanted and he came up with an excuse. And ultimately, Saul was defeated. And he ends up dying a coward's death, where he basically asked someone to drive a sword through him. So then we fast forward to David. David from the very beginning is described as a man after God's own heart. And so here we see someone who's maybe not so physically impressive compared to Saul, but we see a man who worships God, who loves God, and a man who's fearless, right? He, as a shepherd, he's fighting bears and lions as a young boy. And ultimately he's anointed by Samuel while Saul is still alive. And after he is anointed, he defeats Goliath, this giant of a man. But one of the key things about David was, from that moment, everyone was praising David to the point where David could have just stepped in and become king right away. But the key thing with David is he waited. There were many moments where even when he was running away from Saul, God brought Saul right into his grasp, and he could have just killed him and ended it right there. But instead, he waited. And so ultimately, it took more than 20 years for him to become king of all of Israel. But you look at the book of Psalms, the Psalms that he wrote, he continually says, wait upon the Lord. And so one of the different things you see between Saul, who couldn't wait, who was impatient, and David, is that one trusted in God and the other didn't. Now, David also gets a covenant. David also gets a promise. So after he becomes king and he's, sitting in his temple, or not temple, he's sitting in his palace. He's like, this is such a nice house. You know what? God is in a tent. Like, what's up with that? Like, I want to build a house for God. And so he's having this desire. And so Nathan the prophet comes to him and says, you know what? That's a good desire, but God actually wants to do something even greater for you. You want to build a house for God. God wants to build a house for you. And this will be a house that will last forever. And so what becomes clear through this is that through David's sons, through his offspring, there will be a greater king who will establish an everlasting throne. And in Psalm 110, one of David's Psalms, he says, to my Lord. He's speaking to his future son, who he calls his Lord. And so ultimately, David believes in this promise, and he believes that a future son will come who will be the anointed one, who will be this Messiah. But ultimately, David's desire to build a house for God was not going to come. David had shed too much blood according to 1 Chronicles 22, and God intended to do it through his son Solomon. So jumping to Solomon, famously, Solomon, he could have asked for many different things. He asked for wisdom. And so Solomon was a very wise king. And because of making that very wise choice, God blessed him even more. But one of the sad things is from the very beginning, Solomon was already doing bad things. When it talks about him sacrificing at the high places usually represent places of idol worship. And so from the very beginning, Solomon was kind of doing questionable things. It's not very clear whether he was worshiping idols, but he shouldn't have been going to the high places. Now, God does allow him to build the temple, but as you know, Solomon loved women, married 700 wives, 300 concubines. Now, a lot of this was because, he was trying to usher peace, and so he was marrying foreign wives from different nations to ensure peace with those nations. But ultimately, they influenced him. They brought their own beliefs with them, and they turned him from being the one who actually built the temple of God to being someone worshiping idols. And so because of that, God said, because of your father, I will not split the kingdom during your reign, but it's going to happen in the next generation. So that's what happens. Solomon is unfaithful, and so his son, after Solomon passes away, immediately the nation of Israel is split into two, one to the north, one to the south, Israel and Judah. So the north, Israel, has the most tribes, right? It's only missing Judah and Benjamin. But these guys from the very beginning did not follow the line of David. So they weren't following the Davidic Covenant. And every single king, all 19 of them were evil. So they didn't believe in God. They worshiped idols. There are many, many prophets who ministered to them that were trying to bring them back to God. They didn't listen to any of them. And so ultimately they were defeated first by Assyria. And because of this, those 10 tribes are actually still considered lost today. After they were conquered, they never came back. And so there are theories on where the 10 tribes of Israel ended up. But ultimately, if you go to Israel, they only trace back to the tribes of Judah, Benjamin, and Levi, not to the other 10 tribes. And so these tribes have been completely wiped out of history as far as we understand. Now, the southern kingdom lasted about 150 years longer. There were only the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, so they were much smaller in number. But they followed the line of David, and out of the 20 kings, 8 of them were good. 8 of them followed God. So 8 of them, listened to some of the prophets. 8 of them were influenced in a good way. 8 of them did good things in terms of turning back to the word of God. But ultimately, they too were defeated by Babylon about 150 years after the northern kingdom. So basically, you have these two kingdoms split. One kingdom is basically evil from the very beginning. They fall first. The kingdom that was going back and forth between good and bad would fall 150 years later. So this 70 years of exile, talking about the nation of Judah, was already prophesied. So the prophet Jeremiah had already said, this is what's going to happen because of your unfaithfulness, because of all the sins of your fathers. This is what's going to happen. 70 years of exile. No one believed him. Instead, they listened to other prophets that were saying good things. Oh, everything's going to be okay. You're not going to be defeated by Babylon, blah, blah, blah. Egypt's going to come and help you. And so they listened to the false prophets instead. But once they were defeated, once Jerusalem fell, and the first temple, the temple of Solomon, was destroyed, this really messed up the Jewish identity. This really messed up their concept of who they were. All of their belief was on the fact that, look at this great temple we have, look at this great city. Even though their nation was crumbling little by little, they put all of their pride into this building and into what little they still had left. And so they still talked about how God had done amazing things to bring them out of Egypt. But one of the things about people in that time was the way you measured how strong your God was on what was going on presently. So the fact that they were defeated meant that the God of the other nation was stronger than theirs. So the fact that Babylon had defeated them and was forcing them to learn their language, was changing their names, honestly, the Babylonian captivity in many ways is very similar to the Japanese occupation here in Korea, where they were actually completely trying to destroy an identity. But through that, many of the Israelites, their faith crumbled because their understanding, their belief was all focused on this building of the temple and on what God had done in the past. Now, not long after this, Babylon actually quickly fell to the Medo-Persian Empire. And this again was prophesied by Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Daniel. Now, Cyrus the Great, he did something very radical. What he did was he gave religious freedom, which at the time was unheard of. Basically, if you were the conquering kingdom, it was your right to force everyone to follow your beliefs. But what Cyrus did, and it wasn't just to the Jews, but it was to many of the different people groups in his nation or in his empire, was he allowed them to restore their religious identity. And not only that, he gave them gifts to actually build things back up. So what he did was he's like, okay, Jews, go back to Jerusalem and rebuild your temple. I'm going to give you the original things that were in your temple that we took out. I'm going to even bless you with even more. And so the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament that the Jews look at today, ends with 2nd Chronicles. And 2nd Chronicles ends with this declaration by Cyrus. So in many ways, the end of this exile and this allowance to go back to Jerusalem is considered like the crescendo, like the climax in many ways of the Old Testament. And so this return to Zion happens in at least 3 returns. There may have been a 4th, but there are at least 3. And we see this in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. The first is led by Zerubbabel, and they go and they're supposed to, right away they build the altar of the temple, but then they get pressure from other nations. And so they decide not to rebuild the temple right away. So if you look at the numbers, they wait more than 20 years before they rebuild the temple. This is important because actually this is the context of the book of Haggai, and I'll get to that next week actually. The second return, which is led by Ezra, the scribe, they go back and they, his focus is on restoring worship. And so even though the temple had been rebuilt, worship wasn't being done properly, and intermarriage had become a problem. Now, the reason why intermarriage is important is because basically the people of God were meant to stay pure, in the sense that they weren't meant to be influenced by outside cultures, outside beliefs. Now, this doesn't mean that God is against intermarriage, as I've said in the past. I've officiated two interracial marriages, so I'm not against intermarriage. But this is basically more about a faith issue. And so by marrying these other people, they were actually giving up their wives. They were already married to Jewish women, but they were giving up their wives so that they could benefit from other people. And so they were basically selling out their faith. That was what Ezra was calling out. Now Nehemiah, he goes back. Now Nehemiah, the cupbearer, he's more of a government official, and he goes back because he knows that the walls of Jerusalem were still destroyed. And so any city without walls is completely defenseless and is in a position where people don't feel safe. So there's no way you can restore worship when the city is in ruins. And so Nehemiah goes back to rebuild the wall and to finally do the things that Ezra had done as well, restore worship and again address intermarriage. Malachi is the last prophet, and so most likely Malachi falls in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. And so Malachi, he speaks against some of the things that we saw in Ezra and Nehemiah, where people were worshiping improperly. They were giving worthless worship. He speaks against intermarriage again, which is more of a faith issue. And so one of the things that Malachi does is he prophesies of, that there will be a forerunner, that there will be another Elijah. And so he basically prophesies what was to come, that there would be someone like John the Baptist who would be a forerunner for the Messiah. Now, after Malachi gives his prophecies, 400 years of silence would follow. So there'd be 400 years of silence before we get into the New Testament. And so that's basically, in a nutshell, how this very long history starts to come to a close. So now that I'm kind of wrapping up this presentation, what I want you to understand, having gone through this very quickly, is I want you to understand what the Jewish identity is. They're the children of Abraham, and like Abraham, they were chosen. And so they took great pride in the fact that they were children of Abraham. They took great pride in the fact that they were chosen by God. And the things that they could brag about was God himself gave them circumcision. God himself gave them the law of Moses. These were unique things that they could claim was what separated them from other people. This was a sign of their covenant. This was a sign of their relationship. And they even had a book of laws that explained how God wanted them to live. Now, God had miraculously saved them from Egypt through signs and wonders which they would tell and pass on from generation to generation. Now, at a certain point through King David, they actually did become a world power in many ways. And they, through the temple of Solomon, they built in many ways what would be considered a world wonder. But there was a promise made to David that there was going to be a greater son. And so they were having this expectation on who this greater son would be. Unfortunately, as much as their pride had swelled up, it was completely broken down. They were defeated by Assyria and Babylon. The temple was destroyed. They were taken away from the promised land, and they were enslaved for 70 years. And the northern kingdom, the 10 tribes, completely gone. All that's left is Judah, Benjamin, and about half of the tribe of Levi. And so after these 70 years, they're finally allowed to go back to Jerusalem, but they're not independent. They're still being ruled by the Persians. And so this is the context of how the Old Testament ends, is that this is a people that in many ways viewed themselves as like the only child, as a very special child. But ultimately, and they were given things that made them believe this, but that was all taken away. And so now they're left in a position where God had given them these promises, but a lot of them don't know whether to really believe in them or not, because what they're experiencing is not what they thought was going to happen. Now, for us, in many ways, brothers and sisters, this is not too far different from the current situation that we see ourselves in. Is that we're in a position kind of like the Israelites, where they were enslaved. They were going through a hard time. That's kind of how this year has started and gone on. And so in many ways, I really think God is going to speak through the book of Haggai as we see what are the things that he addresses in a time of disappointment, discouragement, and questioning. And so, as we go into that, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to briefly stop the share, and I'm going to ask you guys to come back on, turn on your mics. I'm going to let you unmute yourselves, turn on your cameras. I'm going to split you guys into two groups. And so we're going to have a little bit of time of discussion. I'll make a separate cacao room. Wow, Evan has a whole bunch of people in his room right now. Let me form the groups. Let me stop the YouTube.